All right, welcome to our free GRE prep hour for August 21st, 2022. I'm Dmitry Farber, I'll be your host, and today we are discussing the theme of doing and reviewing time sets. So we're going to think about how we're supposed to time ourselves on the GRE overall, both for individual questions and for sets of questions or whole sections of the test. We're going to talk a bit about how to review your work, and then we'll do some time sets and try to model some of that review process. So not just what's the answer, did you get it right, but more how can I learn from this? How can I get better? And I think this is one of the biggest things that people need to work on when they're studying, is that sometimes either we don't know how to study very well, or we know how to study very well for the kinds of school we've had before, and the GRE sometimes feels different, right? It seems like it's requiring a different kind of study from you. Maybe you've been at it for a while and your score is not improving. And the GRE is a bit different from the kind of tests you might usually take in school, which are often knowledge-based. They often have a clear set of things that you can memorize, not always, right? Sometimes they feel more subjective. You know, maybe you have an essay exam and the professor is going to grade you based on whether they like your opinions or how well you express yourself. And there's less of that going on with the multiple choice part of a GRE. And so all those things are differences from how we might normally study. And so we have to adjust accordingly. All of the problems that we do today will be found in the 5-pound book of GRE Practice Problems that you can buy at finer stores everywhere, but I'm going to have them up on the screen today. But if you find those problems useful, that's where I'm pulling from. We have a limited number of official GRE problems that we're allowed to share in the workshop. So typically for these workshops, I will do problems that we wrote so that we don't do the same problems over and over again in every YouTube workshop. Okay. So let's look at how we're thinking about this. In one of my other classes that I did on here, I've done a few sessions on quant speed strategies. And one of the things I suggested in there for just getting better at quant, but this applies in a lot of ways to verbal as well, is you want to have a strategy for the whole section, which means know how long you're supposed to take on specific kind of questions and build that into benchmarks. How far into the section should I be at each time point? So we're going to talk a bit about that. You want to plan to guess aggressively. And this is something that a lot of my students, even the students who are really strong, find that they have to push themselves on. In fact, the stronger you are at the material, the harder this can be, because you might think, hey, I'm really good at math. I'm an engineer. I was a math major. I studied physics and all these advanced things. Why should I have to guess on some problem about algebra? Because the time is really intense and we have to get used to moving on. And the lovely thing about the GRE, if you've ever taken, say, the GMAT, it's different. On the GMAT, once you move on past a question, that's it. You guess, you go to the next question, and if you got it wrong, there's nothing you can do. On the GRE, you can come back around. So if you guess on the first 5 questions, and then later on you realize, oh, I have more time, great, you can go back and do them. I would still always fill in a guess so that you don't risk the chance of leaving something completely blank, which you don't really want to do. But I would guess aggressively and plan to finish the section, if anything, a bit early so that you have time to go back and do a few of your choice. And the idea there is you're making more active decisions about where to spend your time. You might see a problem that if you had 3-4 minutes, you think you could do, but you don't really have 3 or 4 minutes. You have more like 2. And so you might let that problem go. And then if at the end of the section, you have some extra time to think about it, great, go do it as a bonus, right? Think of it almost like extra credit. So partly this comes down to knowing your skip cues. In other words, what signs are there that I want to let a problem go? That could be upfront things like, oh, I don't know how to do probability, so I always skip those. Or if it's got a big crazy diagram or a long paragraph to process, I'm not going to do that. It might be something more in the experience I'm having as I try to set it up. Hey, if I try to create some equations and then I get stuck, I'm going to let go. Or if I do a lot of work and I get an answer that's not there and I don't see a quick way to revise my work, I'm going to let go. That's more uncomfortable because I've already spent the time, but it still might be the right call. You also want, on both quant and verbal, you want to get good at adjusting for section 2. And what that means is, if you've seen how this test is scored at all, for both verbal and quant, they give you 2 sections plus an experimental of one or the other that doesn't count. But they'll give you a first section, and depending on how you do on that second section, you'll get either a harder second section, a medium second section, or an easier second section. There may be some subdivisions there. They don't fully disclose that, but this is the idea. So someone who does really well can expect the second section to be harder. Someone who misses a whole lot of the questions can expect the second section to be a bit easier. And therefore, you want to adjust for this. If you're one of those people who's trying to get, say a 165 plus on your section, on your quant or your verbal, you might get used to the idea that you are going to get most or all of the questions right on the first section. For instance, I was looking at someone the other day and they did not get a perfect score, but they got all of section 1 quant right, 100%, 20 out of 20. So of course they got a harder second section, and on that harder second section, they got hit much more and they missed many more questions, right? And this is okay, you can still get a good score this way, but you want to adjust for that and be ready for the questions to feel harder. And this is like anything you might do. If you run a marathon at a certain pace, you can expect that as you go on, it'll be harder to maintain that pace. In that case, it's not because the task of running has gotten more difficult, it's because you are getting tired. But it's still that idea of you have to expect that, right? I don't expect that the pace I can run right now is a pace I can necessarily keep running for a very long time, and that's something I'd have to work on and train, right? And so when you look at your second section, you might need to be more selective about which ones you do. You might have to be more mindful of time. Maybe you're so good at math or verbal, whichever we're on, that on the first section, you finish with 8 minutes to spare. And on the second section, you need every minute. It could be the other way around. Maybe you find the first section very, very hard and you miss a lot of questions and you go to an easier second section, but then you have to adjust for that easier second section and say, hey, these are some, I'm going to recover and kind of realize that I got knocked into an easier second section. And now I should be able to be more consistent and get more of these right. And I might guess less aggressively, right? Because I think I can get a whole lot of those right. On the quant side, you also want to leave room for the fill-in questions. There will often be a few questions that are just free response near the end. It's very hard to guess correctly on those because the answer could be anything. So you don't want to time out there and not be able to answer those. And also have a plan for how you're going to deal with the charts and tables of data interpretation partway through the section. In quant, some people skip those entirely and come back around to them. Some people give them a first look and try them, and then just let parts go if they're taking too long. Some people just go in and do them in order, but you want to know what your approach is for that. Any questions on any of that stuff before we start talking about the timing requirements for the individual pieces? Okay. Well, let me show you, since a lot of you said you were pretty new, let me make sure we know how these sections work. And so your verbal section is going to be 30 minutes. Each of your verbal sections will be 30 minutes. And you get 20 questions. So you can do a quick calculation there and see that you get 1.5 minutes per question on average. But not all questions are equal. You'll have quite a few questions that are vocab fill-ins. That's the kind we'll do today, text completion and sentence equivalents. And you'll also have some questions that are reading comprehension, whether it's a short argument or a long, technical passage. And those will naturally take a little bit longer. So we usually figure that for the fill-in questions, you're averaging about 1 minute per question. And for the reading comp questions, you're averaging about 2 minutes per question, including reading time. So for instance, I might read a long passage for 3 minutes and then spend about 1 minute each on 3 follow-up questions for a total of 6 minutes and 3 questions. But it should average out to about 2 minutes. And for this reason, it's really important to develop some timing benchmarks. Some people might just divide the tests into quarters and say, okay, well, if I have 30 minutes for the whole section, then okay, I should take 15 minutes for the first half. And if I chop that in half again, after the 5th question, I should have taken 7.5 minutes. But that would be actually really problematic, because after the 5th question, you've only done text completion to that point. And if you've been running 7.5 minutes, right, that means you're running 1.5 minutes on questions that are designed to only take 1 minute. And so it's useful to develop question or section specific benchmarks that take all that into account. And so in a minute, I'll give you a link that you can use to look at our blog post about this. But we talk about having some individual benchmarks. You can also adjust this for yourself. You might find that you often finish the first 7 faster than 1 minute each. Maybe you only need 5 minutes to do the first 6 or 7 questions. And you're still very accurate. Maybe that's like a superpower of yours. Then you have a little bit more time for reading comp. Or sometimes I have students who are the opposite. They're very fast readers. And accordingly, they have a little more room to slow down on fill-in questions. And that can just vary from person to person. And within the sections, they also vary. Some of the text completion have just one blank and they're not that bad. And some have 3 and they look like a big paragraph full of text and they're going to take probably more than a minute. So it kind of averages out. Okay. Questions about this stuff? So the idea would be that you're building, when you're doing practice sets, you're building a set based on these requirements or on these numbers. So if I'm going to do only fill-in questions, I would simply give myself a minute per question. And if I'm going to do a set of 5, I'd give myself 5 minutes for 5 questions. If I'm going to mix in reading comprehension, then I'd average in 2 minutes per question. And that would include the time I spent reading the passages. I do a few questions per passage usually, unless it's very short. Okay. So I will put up on the screen this link for those who are watching this in recording, but I'll also put a link in the chat for those of you who are here right now. If you want to check out our timing blog, it's a several part blog post about timing. You might want to check this out. But the basic idea is that you want to get used to section specific benchmarks and you want to apply those. And this is one of the most important things you can do to get better at this test. All the time I'll talk to people who say, well, I took a test and it was pretty good, but I ran out of time. And they'll say it as if, well, what are you going to do? Right? It would be like if I said, I tried to do 100 push-ups and I couldn't. I had to stop at 20 because, I was tired. Well, sure, right? That's normal. And maybe I can't do 100 push-ups, at least not in a row. But with GRE timing, anyone can finish on time. Anyone. Yes, you, right? Because you just let go of problems. Doesn't mean you get them all right. Doesn't mean you can get all of the questions correct or even do a good job on them all in that time. But you can finish. It's just a matter of moving past things and letting things go. And I always say, if you have to choose between being right and being on time, choose being on time every time, because you're trying to maximize your overall performance, not any one question. It's not about number 7 or about number 12. It's about how many total you get right. And you don't want to lose 3 questions because you're focusing obsessively on one, especially because when we're focusing obsessively on one, it often means we're not doing it well. We are getting it wrong. And so that's really something to watch. Okay. So this is how I'd build a set. So in a moment, we'll do a set of fill-in questions, text completion and sentence equivalents. And I'll just do 3 of them. So we'll give ourselves 3 minutes to do those. I'm not going to do reading comp today because it's hard to fit those into a time set on the screen in this setting, and also because it's a bit more of a discussion piece just to process the passage. So that's something I certainly recommend that you work on, and we have some recordings on that, but we're not going to do reading comp today. So the other thing that I really strongly recommend, and it's to me one of those things that just people might think of as optional, and it really isn't, I don't think, is that you do some blind review. And I'll try to model some of this today. And the key idea behind blind review is that you review your work before you even know whether you're right or wrong. That's the blind part. So the standard thing people do is they do a set of problems or individual problems, and then they just see if they got it right or wrong. If they got it right, cool. Maybe they check the explanation to see if there's anything interesting there. Maybe they just move on. And if they got it wrong, they say, okay, well, how do I do it? Or what did I miss? And this is fine. It's how most of us have practiced at some point. It's not, an inherently incorrect way to study exactly, but it's not nearly productive enough for what you want. And the main problem is that it makes us a little too passive. When we get a question right, we're saying, okay, this is fine, nothing more to learn here. And when we get a question wrong, we're saying, okay, tell me what I did wrong, instead of, how do I know if I'm right or wrong? You ever have that feeling on a test that you think you're right, but you're just not sure? And you can sit there and kind of go back and forth, right? In the movies, it's always one of those intense situations, like you're trying to defuse a bomb and you think you're supposed to snip the red wire, but oh my gosh, what if it's the blue one and you're wrong and everything's going to blow up? Oh no, right? And even though the GRE is not life or death, hopefully, there's not a room full of people counting on you or anything like that. It still can feel that way. It can feel like, how can I possibly make the wrong decision? What will I do? So one thing is to remember that, hey, if you get this question wrong, so what? In fact, you'll never know on a real test, you'll never know whether you got that one question right or wrong. You'll just know how you did overall. But second, You can get better at telling if you're right or wrong. You can get better at finding out. It would be like if you could just look up, should I snip the red wire or the blue wire? Oh, there it is, right? We don't get to look anything up during the test, but we do get to work on things to improve our confidence. So let's talk about that process a little bit and then we'll model it. So the first step is do problems in time sets. And your goal is to get as many points in that set as you can. On the GRE, within a section, all the points are the same. So whether it's a quick question that you did in 20 seconds, whether it's one of those 3-putters that says choose all that apply, whether it involves a graph or table or passage, no matter what it is, each question is worth the same. Which means you don't want to overinvest on the harder questions if that's not what's going to give you the best yield. Right? Think of the harder the question is, the more it's like extra credit that you do if you have the time. So that's really important, but always try to answer all the questions no matter what. Not even try, do answer all the questions no matter what. Make that a goal. To me, someone who doesn't answer all of the questions in a section is just a beginner, right? You're not serious yet, right? Not serious is a mean way, but you're not ready yet. So if you're taking practice tests right before your exam and you're timing out, then you're not ready. Don't go. You have to get to the point where it's not even a question. You always answer all of them. You don't have to do well, but you always answer all of them. And then do your review before you check the answers. That's the big thing. That's what I mean by the blind review, right? Blind, what I'm saying by that is you're doing it before you check the answers. So what are you asking yourself? First, what was this question testing? Is this a divisibility question? Is it testing ratios? Is it rates and work? How do I know what this is? And did I correctly recognize this? Sometimes people don't even realize that they misinterpreted the question. They go, oh, I thought this was supposed to strengthen the argument and it's really an inference question. I misread the prompt. How do I know that I'm answering the right question? And this is going to help me on the test when I'm sitting there going, did I get this right? I taught a class today where a bunch of people got the same answer that was just the right answer to a different question. And we had to kind of fine tune and say, what are you really supposed to be doing here? How else could I have solved this? Maybe there are other approaches that are worse. Maybe there are approaches that are better. How do I tell which one it is? Do I like the way I did it? If I did it in a reasonable amount of time, how did I do that? Could I do it even faster? If I did it in 2 minutes, can I do it in 1? If I did it in 1, can I do it in 40 seconds? And the point is not that I need to do all these problems in 40 seconds, but if I can do this problem in 40 seconds, maybe there's another problem right now that's too hard that I can do in 2 minutes or less. Okay, so how do I know, how do I make that selection? Did I use my time well? Did I make good choices about that? If I made a gamble, did it pay off? Right? And we don't just want to assess that based on whether it worked this time. Is this something I'd want to repeat? Right? So if you sold your house and spent all the money on lottery tickets and won, that's amazing, but you probably wouldn't tell everyone, see, that's the way to go. You should all do this, right? We might have the same results. And if you did that again, you might not have the same results. So if you sell the mansion you bought with your lottery money and try to win again, maybe you won't be able to do it, right? So we got to watch that kind of thing. So don't just judge based on how many I got right, but also, how did that affect me? Did I have to guess a lot because I spent a lot of time on one question? And did I even get the question I spent long on, right? One of the most important things I'm always looking for is more upfront work. Is there a way I could have slowed down at the beginning to understand what they were asking better so I can answer it correctly? On verbal, it's often about prediction. On quant, it's about estimation or recognizing how I can organize my data or rephrase the question so that it's an easier thing to answer. In verbal, this often is about prediction, like I said. So it's things like, oh, why does the author mention network theory on line 12? Or what was a problem that they cited with the treaty that was negotiated, right? Or what word should go in this blank? What kind of word? And then also on verbal, what makes every single choice right or wrong? How do I know that, if I chose B, it's not A or C, et cetera? And how can I be very consistent about that, right? Assuming that we're dealing with multiple choice. And then I want to go back at this point and check my answers. On a lot of these, if I've reviewed very thoroughly, I should feel pretty good. Either I say, hey, I got it right, I knew all along, and now I've verified it, or I got this wrong, but I figured out what happened. Right? I caught my mistake. But every now and then you might check your answers and be surprised. You might say, wait, B? I had A and I was sure, and I proved it 3 different ways. So what am I missing here? right? This is a surprise a lot of people have very quickly because they check their answers immediately. I'm just saying to delay that, right? And learn from that. And you go, wow, all the ways I did it were wrong. So what's going on? And you might jump to this. If you do a problem and you have no idea at all what to do about it, then you'd skip a lot of these questions because you'd say, hey, I just don't know this at all. I need to just learn this. But if it's something that you know how to do, or you think you know how to do, then you do those steps. And then you go to explanations and say, all right, so how did they do it in the explanation if there is one? What can I learn from that? Maybe you see something new. And add to your notes. Maybe you have some topic specific notes like, hey, I've got a set of notes just about stats or just about rates and work or just about, logic based reading comp. But you can also just have some general notes about process. And the ones I'm most concerned about are the easiest problems I missed. And the reason I say that is those are the ones that I didn't need to miss, right? I look at a problem and go, oh, that was so easy. I know how to do this, but wait, why did I pick B? Whereas if it's a really hard problem, you can learn from that, of course. But with that, you feel less bad about it because you say, yeah, well, it was hard, right? That was not surprising. I missed that. I want to learn from it, but it's not as important to catch as the problem I already knew how to do because I don't want to miss anything that I already know. Okay. This all right? Questions? So we're going to try to model some of this. I'm going to give you a set of 3 fill in the blank verbal questions. 2 of them are text completion and 1 is sentence equivalence. And just while we're talking for a moment, I'm going to cover the answers so we don't get too ahead of ourselves. But what you'll see here is 2 of them have, 2 of them have 2 blanks. These are text completion. Right. 1 word per blank. And then 3 is sentence equivalence. You want to choose 2 equivalent words that have same or similar meaning for the blank, right? So it'll have 2 answers. And what I want you to do is write down your answers for all 3 of these within the next 3 minutes and make it a goal that when I call 3 minutes, you've got your answers down on your paper for all 3. No cheating. All right, so this is the process. Ideally, you want to predict first before you go to the answers, and that way you'll be able to review, hey, did I predict well? If I just do problems in my head, then later on, when I'm trying to see how I thought about it or why I chose this or that, I don't have as much of a record, especially if I'm reviewing it on another day. Whereas if I have a clear record of my work and say, oh, here were my fill-ins, did that part go right? Then I can understand my process a little bit better and I can know how to improve it. So I'll give you the answer choices and I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. So make sure you're planning to have all these 3 written down in 3 minutes. However, you have to do that, even if they're guesses in some cases. Sometimes the vocab might be too tough. That's fine. Just do what you can. So let's take 3 minutes and we'll check in. Here we go. All right, let's talk about these three. So if you haven't already, please write down answers on your paper, or just commit in your mind to what your answers are going to be. And true to form, I'm not going to tell you the answers right away. We're going to do some blind review, but I will be asking for your answers in a moment. You can set the chat to me only, so that when you do send me your answers, it's just going to me. So we are holding off and being as blind as possible to what the answers really are. Okay. But no need to send yet. Let's see what we have. Right. So going to our questions for a blind review, the idea is we're not immediately worried about whether we got them right or wrong. What we're worried about is what our process looked like. So the first thing I want to ask you, and actually, I guess you can not set chat to just me yet. You can say this to the room. How did it go for time purposes, right? Did you finish all three? Whether you got them right or not, we don't know. Whether you feel good about them or not, maybe we know. But how did you do for time? So in fact, I'll just do it this way. Give me an A on the poll if you finished all three, right or wrong. We don't know, but A if you finished all three, B if you finished two, C if you just finished one. I suppose you can give me D if you didn't finish any, but I'm guessing that you finished at least one of the questions. Okay. Most people who are polling in say they got through all three. Great. And this is, of course, going to vary. Some sets you might find easy. Oh, yeah, I could have done this in 2 minutes. If that's normally the case for you, what I would suggest is that you tighten up your time. So maybe you were really fast. Okay, cool. Everyone who's pulled in has said they did all three. So maybe you're really fast on these. Maybe you don't need a minute, or maybe you only need an average of a minute because the longest ones take longer. In that case, push it so you're a little uncomfortable, because you want to get ready to be uncomfortable on test day. Maybe you won't be uncomfortable in session one, you'll only be comfortable in section two, or vice versa, right? Maybe if the test is pretty hard for you, you'll struggle a lot in the first section, and then the second section will be a little bit easier and you have a little bit more room to breathe. But one way or the other, you want to push that challenge level. So if you're normally getting these done in, say, 40 seconds, then give yourself that much per question in some time sets for a while to see how it goes. You can even overdo it, right? You can give yourself less time than you're comfortable with, so you're forced to choose some to drop, and that could be a really good practice. Like, which one should I drop and why? So for instance, you all did these, but if you were going to drop one, which one would you do? First, second, or third? Which one would you least want to spend time on? That can be interesting to think about, right? Of course, you don't get to see them all in a set like this. You have to click them one at a time, but you might look at one and say, "Ooh, no, I'm not spending time on this," or you might come back around to one because it wasn't as bad as you thought, right? Or the other ones were worse. So you might look at the language. For instance, if you look at the words in the first and third and find them really difficult, whereas most of the words in the second, then you're going to want to make sure you have time for the second one, and you might not be so concerned about the others, but that's really going to vary. You might also look at the second one and say, hey, that's kind of long and it's got 2 blanks. So it just looks like it might take more work to fill in and think about than the others. Okay. So that's the time side of things. And then it's process and approach. Now on verbal, there's only so many approaches we can take, let's be honest. We're going to read the sentence. We're going to try to predict an answer, and we're going to look for it. There are not a lot of ways to do these. There are some alternatives on the sentence equivalence part that we'll talk about, but it's a little bit less diverse than on, say, Quant, where maybe you did algebra, maybe you did a diagram, maybe you picked some numbers and tested a few different cases. Maybe you just memorized a case like this and you knew what the answer should be. There are a lot of different possibilities. With text completion and sentence equivalence, it's kind of one method that we all do. The one thing that we differ on is how strict we are about filling in the words. I'm very pushy about fill something in, like write something down on your paper, write something down to represent what goes in that blank before you go to the answers, so you don't get fooled by the answers, you don't have your time wasted. They designed these to entrap people who are not predicting. Okay. So let's look at then how we'd know. And one of the things you want to look at, whether you got this right or wrong, we'll find out, is what were the clues and how confident were you? A lot of times people find themselves sort of guessing on these questions. They say, well, this one makes sense to me. I like that answer. It seemed logical, rather than I could prove it. I know this one's right and the others are wrong. That's more what I want. So even if you end up getting all three of these right, and that's wonderful if you do, you might still look back and say, how confident was I? Did I know I was right? And how did I know? And can I repeat that process? Or did I feel like I was guessing? And if you got it wrong, you might say, did I choose an answer that I thought had a strong basis? Or did I know I was kind of on shaky ground, right? Okay. So what clues do we have about what goes in this in these first blanks? Okay. So the plan, if it can be called that, that's snarky, right? So critical. The plan, if it can be called that, has been more of a blank vision than a concrete proposal. And notice we have a semicolon here, which is a clue. It tells us, hey, this is kind of a sentence ends there. So this might be enough right here to fill in the blank, right? If I want to have more of a blank vision than a concrete proposal, forgetting these words, pretend these words aren't even here. So don't give me necessarily one of these words. Just what fill in did you put, or what fill in makes sense here? What would be a good contrast to a concrete proposal? So far, what I know is that the plan isn't much of a plan, right? The author seems negative about it, and that it's not concrete. Yeah, so something that's all over the place, that sounds good. Yeah, something that's so maybe scattered, sketchy, unclear, something that's the opposite of a concrete proposal. A concrete proposal is like, hey, we're going to do this, and here's how it will work. And this is more like, well, maybe we can all just try to get along, kind of thing, right? Okay. Like many similarly blank ideas, it is unlikely ever to come to fruition. Now, anytime you run across a word you're not comfortable with, that would be something to flag for later. So some of you may be very comfortable with come to fruition, meaning basically fruition is like fruiting, like it finishes its process, it happens, right? If you didn't know that, you could say, hey, that's something to look up, because that's obviously going to get away in a little bit. But I might also look back and say, hey, I didn't know what fruition meant, but I got the idea. It was a shaky plan. And like many similarly shaky ideas, right? It's unlikely to ever, well, probably something meaning about it's actually happening, right? So even if I had never heard the word fruition in my life, I might still get the idea that it's a bad plan, or it's and bad specifically in the sense of not concrete. And like many similarly bad, not concrete ideas, it's probably not going to happen. Okay, and so I think it could be interesting to look at first, did I know this word? And if not, how could I have worked around it? Did I do that successfully? And those are questions I'd ask myself. And I wouldn't be too quick to say, oh, I just didn't know the word. A lot of people always blame vocab. They're like, oh, I didn't know the vocab, so what can I do? But often we get things wrong when we do know the words. And in fact, I'll see people who know exactly what's supposed to go in the blank. And then they'll choose a word that they know doesn't fit that blank because they're afraid of the word they don't know. And I have to say, well, wait a minute, you know what you want, you were right, and we agreed on it, and now you're picking something else. So it's not always just about the vocab. Okay, so at this point, we would work with the answer choices that we have and do that. So go ahead and change chat if you haven't already to just me, and send me your two answers for this if you haven't yet. What'd you have for these two? And these might just be, guesses if you don't know those words. Okay. I don't know if some of you are on a device that's not letting you chat, but I'm not seeing a lot of answers yet. Let's put those in if you can, but I'm going to go ahead, keep things moving. So I want something that means like it's not concrete. So oppositional, I got to cross out. If I'm oppositional, I'm opposing you. That could be pretty concrete. I can be saying no, right? Martial, if you don't know this one, has to do with war, right? You can institute martial law, right? Martial arts are the arts of war, combat, right? So, and the more you can connect those things, right? You might not ever forget, oh yeah, martial arts, I knew about those. I never thought about what that meant. Oh, it's the art of war. Okay, I get it. You're not going to, kung fu class to like learn how to like raid a battle top or, I can't talk, a mountaintop or something like that, but you can connect it, right? Protean, that's a word you might just have to memorize. In the Odyssey, Odysseus has to grab Proteus, who's like this shape-shifting god of the sea, and then they use that in some movies since, like for instance, famously Terminator 2, they have the character that keeps shifting forms and things like that. So Protean is something that's always shifting. Some people's careers are like that; they're always doing something new, they're always different. But that's like a very specific word you don't hear a lot in casual conversation. So you might just need a flashcard for that. So one thing you might do as part of your review process is build up a list of things that are going to go on flashcards. This can be words you didn't know at all. This could be words you misunderstood, or this could be words that you know, but you just don't know the definition. And that's most words, honestly, right? I'm constantly looking up words while I'm teaching, not because I have a bad vocabulary. I was an English major. My dad was an English professor. I have a native speaker of English, and I read all the time. I know tons of words, but even still, most of them I can't define. And I don't know all their uses, and so I'm constantly checking. Can you use this word this way? Is that right? And that way I'm expanding my range. When I was studying for the test actively, I had a list of words that were kind of like my embarrassing words, because they're words I wouldn't want anyone to see that I was looking up, but words that I didn't feel 100% on. Like, do I know what they actually mean? So building up flashcards for those things to make them more familiar. And then pragmatic is practical. So this is the opposite, and they love to give us opposites. Quixotic, you might never have heard of before. You might. It comes from the novel Don Quixote. And then unorthodox, we think of orthodox as like religion, right? Following the strict rules of a religion. Unorthodox would be untraditional. And that would certainly be a reasonable assumption that these kind of proposals that are a little shaky might be untraditional proposals. The problem is, although that could be true, we don't really know that untraditional proposals are less likely than others to happen. That might make sense, but I just don't know. Maybe, think of a very simple proposal like, I'm going to sell you this and you're going to give me money for it. That's a very traditional proposal. Hey, want to buy my bike? But it might not happen. You might not want to buy my bike. Whereas if I gave you a less traditional proposal, it might be something that was more appealing to you. So we just don't know whether the traditional part of it is a factor. This makes sense as an answer. And so if you're reviewing and you chose unorthodox, what you'd want to look back is to say, did I really have proof that it was non-traditional? Whereas quixotic is a related word. Quixotic is kind of like quirky or weird or individual, but it also has this idea of almost like a lost cause. The character Don Quixote was like famously tilting at windmills. He was going after the windmills thinking they were monsters. So it's you go off on your own very personal quest that's not necessarily that deeply tied to reality. So it has more of a shaky basis than unorthodox. I could be unorthodox in that either I don't follow a particular religion, or I don't believe in what other people believe, or I don't follow the rules, but I might still do that in a successful way. Whereas quixotic implies more of like whimsical and uncertain and out of touch. Okay, so it's partly sometimes getting the spins of words. Quixotic and unorthodox both might be used like in a sentence equivalence. I could even imagine them both going in the same blank, even though they don't mean quite the same thing. They have some related uses, but here one makes much more sense or has more support than the other. Okay. In the next one, let's see, chat me in your answers back to private chat. Chat me in your answers for the second one if you haven't already. On this one, what we got to watch is we want to make sure that we're not going too quickly on just what makes sense with the sentence. And what I mean by that is, if I just read part of the sentence, in her opening remarks, the school's director empathized with the apparent blank of taking disciplinary action. I might just say something like the parent need of taking disciplinary action. Sure, we need to do it. Or I might say the apparent importance. Oh, it's important to take disciplinary action. Or I might say the apparent lack. Hey, maybe the teacher, the director emphasized that people weren't really doing this, and that was maybe hard to do or created a problem, right? But we don't know anything yet. We don't know what was happening to disciplinary action. So in this one, even though there is a semicolon again, we got the end of a clause, the end of basically a sentence. We don't really know what's supposed to go on that blank. We have to keep going. And one really big clue here is that they say on the one hand, while on the other. So they're giving us a contrast. On the one hand, teachers can ill afford to blank disruptive behaviors. On the other hand, overly strict administration can actually foster such behaviors. So we have to kind of compare, right? If you're too strict, people misbehave, right? But on the other hand, you can ill afford to do what? Right? You're too nice, people disrupt it, by misbehaving, right? And so you can ill afford to, let's say, tolerate. So it's this kind of tricky situation. If you let everyone mouth off and do whatever they want and throw things in the class, that's a problem. But on the other hand, if you try to be too strict, no one likes you and they cause more trouble, right? Okay. So now we can go back and say we've got this funny situation where you're kind of stuck on either side. What's our word for that, right? What's a situation where you've got two things pulling you in opposite direction? That's a paradox. And that's one we might actually predict in advance. But if you don't want paradox because it's kind of a strong, you might say dilemma, puzzle, difficulty, right? And so I would look at necessity and say, hey, I'm sure it is kind of necessary to have some disciplinary action, but that's not what they're saying. So it's a nice familiar word, but it's not what they're saying. Entreaty is when you're pleading for something. You're asking someone to do something. That's not what we want. Whereas a paradox is a contradictory situation. The classic paradox would be one where you literally contradict yourself. You say something like, I'm lying to you right now. Well, that's not possible. If I'm lying, then it's not true that I'm lying. So I'm telling the truth. And right, the computer blows up when you tell it these things. But a paradox can be any just contradictory situation. And then I want a word that means tolerate. So I might just need to look these words up if I weren't sure. Fabricate means to make. In Spanish, a fábrica is a factory, but there's a lot of, prefabricated. You tell something someone makes up a fabrication. Fabric is like made of stuff, right? So it's to make, right? To mitigate is to lessen or ease something, right? And brook, we think of this as it may be like a stream, some water, but these will all be the same part of speech. So we'd call here a brook would be a verb here, and brook in this case means to tolerate, to put up with. It's often used in the negative, like I will brook no disrespect means I won't tolerate it. Okay, so it might just be adding to our list of words. Okay. And then I saw a few people already putting in answers for the last one. Make sure for the last one, you're choosing two. So we want to pick two answers that mean roughly the same thing here. And so here's one place where we can have more than one strategy, because I can try to predict, and hopefully you did, but I might also look back and say, what are some words that pair? Do we see any words that definitely mean close to the same thing here? And it's hard, of course, if you don't know a lot of the words, but do you see any words that pair? Yeah, naive and callow both mean, they have slightly different spins to them. Like naive is like you're unsophisticated, maybe a little gullible. Callow it implies more like youth and inexperience, but they're both would apply to someone who doesn't really know what's going on in the world, isn't really, fully caught up with what's happening. And then if I look at the others, perspicacious is basically similar to perceptive, right? sensing things. Contemptible is like hateful, like you like someone that you would hate, right? Really bad. You probably know what keen is. It can be sharp, like a sharp edge to something. It can be smart. It could be you're eager to do something. And disinterested, this is actually a really important word to learn. I'm not going to put a definition down, but it's important to dig into because it has to do with the idea that you don't have, it doesn't mean you're uninterested. It means you don't have a vested interest. Like you don't have a financial concern in something, for instance. So if I go to a judge to settle a case and they're a disinterested observer, that means that they don't have an opinion one way or the other in advance. They're going to be neutral and then they're going to decide what's right. And so one way to get this right is that there's only one word that pairs. But then we could also look back and say, hey, what am I contrasting? They're saying in place of settled judgment, he's offering an adolescent disaffection. You might not know what disaffection is, but you might say, hey, on the one hand, we might want him to give a judgment. On the other hand, he's acting like an adolescent. And so he's politically what? And I might say something like immature or even unwise, right? They're saying, hey, they like his writing, but when it comes to politics, he's not really giving like settled opinions. He's more just like lashing out like an angry teenager. When you're disaffected, you're rebellious, you're upset, you're disenchanted with the system. You want things to go down. And so that's where naive and callow are. So on the one hand, these are harder to guess. Obviously it depends on the words, but they're harder to guess randomly because you have to pick 2 out of these, and the chance of doing that randomly is only 1 in 15. But the nice thing is if you know that there are some words that don't pair, then your chance can be all the way up to 100% without even reading the sentence if you know that there's not very many pairs you can make. And if there are a few pairs you can make, then you just go for one of those pairs, and you can do that again without feeling perfect about the sentence. So these are some things you might do in your review process. I said we do a math set, and we took a long enough on this that I won't have you do a whole set on math, but I do want to talk briefly about how we think about math sets. So the basic idea here would be that in a quant section, you are doing 2 minutes per question on most of them, but the quantitative comparison questions that come at the beginning of the section, these are the ones that ask you to compare 2 columns. Those you only have about 1:15 for those. And that's, they're not literally timed that way, but that's what would allow you to finish this section more or less on time, because a lot of the other questions will need 2 minutes, but this can vary from person to person. But what I find a lot is people will run to 3-4 minutes on just a couple questions. And next thing you know, they're crashing on time because it adds up very quickly. So you really want to make sure that you're not allowing those questions that are well over 2 minutes to, take over your section. You don't want to do that. So make sure you're thinking about that as you do your quant section. So if you're doing a small set, you might do let's say a quantitative comparison and 2 discrete quant, which are just all the regular quant, in 5 minutes, or a little more, 5:15, right? Allowing for the fact that the column ones are going to take a little less time. Actually, what I'll do, if anyone wants to stick around, since we don't have time to review the work, but I did say we do a verbal and a quant set. Let me just toss a quant set at you. So if you want to stay for this, you can. If you need to go at the hour, that's fine too. But I'll throw a set at you because this has a quant comp at the beginning. It would be 5:15 that we take on it. So if you want to try this set, we can do 5:15 on it, and then I'll indicate the answers for you to review on your own. So let's give you that time for that. Notice that first one's meant to be reasonably fast, so you got to watch your time on that. If you don't want to overinvest. The last one is a fill in the blank. So if you don't have time to do it, then your chances of guessing right are very low. So that's something to think about as you budget your time. Okay, so let's take 5:15. See what we can do. What I'll ask you to do is when you're done, pull in A when you're done with all 3. Just so I know that people are done. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's take a look at these. So let me just show you some of this. In the interest of time, we're running a little long, so we won't have a whole discussion on these. But one thing you want to think about is, did I get done? So let me actually ask you to pull that. So give me the same idea. A, if you got through all three, right or wrong, good or bad. A, if you got through all three. B, if you got through two. C, if you just got to one of them. So this is a bit tougher. And one of the things you want to think about is, how did I use my time? Did I end up spending a lot of time on that first one getting stuck? Did that second one just take me forever and then I got something weird and I was off and things like that? So I really want to think about, was it worth it? The third one is not necessarily the easiest one, but if you know how to do it, it's not so bad, right? If you know the formula for it. And so it's partly a matter of just having the time to do it. So if you already have our 5-pound book, you could check these out in there. If not, let me get the answers up there, right? So in 10 factorial, we're going to find threes at 3, 6, and 9. 3 has 1 3, 6 has 1 3, 9 has 2 3s. And so we're talking about 4 possible values of 3, powers of 3. And then if we're wanting to know how many 5s, we're going to find 5s in 5 and 10. So there's 2 powers of 5 in 10 factorial, and double that would be 4. These are the same. On a quant comp, that means the answer is C. The 2 columns are always the same. B, the answer is 28. So one thing you might think about is, if you got an answer that was really far from that, what could you predict? We know it's going to take much more time for one robot than for 700 robots. So I might say, hey, it takes 12 seconds for 700 bots, and one job is going to be 12 seconds. So I could figure that, hey, 700 bots doing 12 jobs would take 12 times 12 seconds, right? 12 times as long. But then if I want to have one bot and 12 jobs, then I'd expect that to take 12 times 700 seconds, right? So it's 12 times the work to do, and 1/700th of the workers, both of them make it longer. And then to turn it into hours, I need to divide by 3600, which is how many seconds are in an hour. So I could do something like this and like that. And I could take out a 12 and a 3. And then finally 3 and 12 would cancel the 4. And I get 28. So I can do something like that. But you might look back and say, hey, did I get a really too large answer, too small answer? Is there a way I could have estimated this a little bit better? If I just knew roughly that, for instance, 12 seconds, there's, they do 5 jobs in a minute. So they should do 300 jobs in an hour, the 700 nanobots. And so one nanobot is going to take a lot longer than an hour. And so I might use that. And then this last one, virtually impossible to do if you have to guess. But if I know that these intersect at the same point, that means they have the same X and Y values. So I could just plug in those X and Y values. So I'd say 3 equals 1x plus 10. But I'd also, for the second equation, say 3 equals 1b plus a, whatever that is. And then I can just set those equal. X plus 10. Did I do that right? Sorry, not X, 1a. So I could say a plus 10 equals b plus a. The a's cancel. And b is 10. Okay. So what I'd recommend that you do on your own time is now give this a more thorough review. Now, we didn't review it blind because it was a bonus set at the end, but you do want to look back and say, not just did I get it right or wrong, but did I recognize what was being tested? Did I know what I need to know? For instance, did I know how to set up those equations for lines? If I did I have a chance to do it, or did I miss it because I was dealing with nanobots for like 5 minutes, right? How did I allocate my time? Are there places where I could have narrowed down, predicted, or otherwise simplified what I was trying to do? And then if you do have access to explanations anywhere, you would look at those and see, all right, are there other ways I can think about to do it? Or was there something that I just did that you wouldn't have thought to do? Even if it's a little thing like, oh, I can cancel more instead of multiplying the whole top of the fraction on my calculator and then multiplying the bottom and then putting them in again, maybe I can cancel some more things and make it easier. Or maybe you looked at what I did and thought, hey, that's too messy. I can do more of that in my calculator, but what works for you? Okay. I will stop there. I'll put those answers back up on the screen for anyone that wants them in just a second. I'd love to see you in one of our courses, so check us out. You can always sit in on the first session of one of our courses for free. Just let us know and we'll sign you up. I'll put these notes back up on the screen. Any questions for me, stick around. Other than that, I'm going to shut things down. Thank you very much for everyone coming around. Good luck on your test.